Hello, welcome everyone. I'm Ramone Segree on the faculty of the Nonprofit Management Program in the School of Professional Studies at Columbia University. Thank you for joining us. We think that this will be an exciting and a workshop that will stimulate some great thinking. We're here together today for Paradigm Shift, New Directions and Opportunities for Diversity and Fundraising due to the Racial Equity Awakening as well as the coronavirus, where we want to take a look at diversity, inclusion, and advancement in the field of philanthropy through the lens of a societal paradigm shift influenced by the coronavirus pandemic and the awakening to racial equity that's occurring at this time. Now, initially, I want to thank each of you for joining us, and we want to thank the presenters for taking part in this very important seminar, this very important webinar and very important and current topic. I'm going to introduce the presenters, but before I do that, I want to provide some important acknowledgments as well as webinar logistics. This webinar is provided by the Nonprofit Management Program at Columbia University School of Professional Studies. This webinar is one in our Professional Development Workshop series. Following the presenter introductions and my brief remarks to provide some context, we will hear separately from each presenter. I want to say to you that you should write your questions down. There is a Q&A box that you will see in front of you, and please put your questions there. We will capture those, but we won't be answering questions until the end of each of the presentations. Now, in thinking about this topic, I couldn't think of three better professionals to present. By way of disclaimer, if in fact I need to say that, we go back more than 30 years, the four of us, as colleagues and leaders through active involvement in the International Association of Fundraising Professionals, as professionals in the field of philanthropy and as advocates and leaders on the subject that we're speaking about today, active engagement and inclusion of diverse professionals and the advancement of this profession. Our presenters are Ruby Love, Maria Gitin, and Alphonce Brown. I want to introduce them. Ruby Love. Ruby is a transformational business leader. She is an entrepreneur and strategist, I should say, known for advocating for social responsible business and community organizations. Her career has generated millions of much needed support for arts, education, STEM, social services, and advancing philanthropy. She has served as chair of the executive team of Association of Fundraising Professionals, AFP, in Rockland, Illinois, Chicago, Illinois, and Washington State. Following over 30 years as principal of Love Resource Development Group, she transitioned to Venture Scale, one of Washington State's first social purpose corporations. Among her projects were advancing environment, social governance, ESG, I'm sure you've heard of that, for CEOs of major companies, and hosting the first Impact Challenge for Google. Ruby gained her interest and skills as an activist, organizer, and leader for racial justice from her parents who led civil rights in her community. For her presentation, Ruby will focus on career and donor landscape. Now, Maria Gitin. Maria is a national development consultant and diversity trainer, certified fundraising executive, retired, who began her work in racial justice as a student civil rights worker as a freshman in college. After witnessing the beatings of nonviolent protesters on the bridge in Selma, she volunteered to be trained by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC. She has worked with a voter registration project in rural Alabama following that. During her career in philanthropy, she led training for the National Center for Nonprofit Boards, Tides and Kellogg, and the Peter F. Drucker Foundations. She has led national diversity and fundraising training and consulted on major capital campaigns for organizations serving underfunded constituents, including Native American, Latinx, African American, LGBTQ community, and women. She is the author of This Bright Light of Ours, Stories from the Voting Rights Fight. She has presented at civil rights and history museums and at universities including Vanderbilt, Stanford, University of South Alabama, Sonoma Emory, Sonoma State, and Monterey Institute of International Studies. Maria has received recognition for her lifetime commitment to civil rights and racial justice from the YWCA, NAACP, the states of Alabama and California, and the U.S. Congress, among others. For the presentation, Maria will focus on issues of equity. Alphonce J. Brown, Jr. Alphonce earned an Advanced Certified Fundraising Executive, ACFRE. He currently serves as Interim Director of Development and Alumni Relations at Stetson University College of Law, First Law School in the state of Florida, where he's responsible for overall management of the office and laying the foundation for launching the college's major gift campaign. Might I say that through his consulting firm over many years, he's been involved in projects such as this one. Alphonce has extensive experience in higher education, nonprofits, development strategic planning, organizational development, and capital campaign feasibility studies. He has worked extensively with small and large universities, faith-based governmental and other nonprofit organizations, and he also was past chairman of the International Board of Directors for AFP. That's the International AFP, past chairman. As we know, it's a 33,000 global member organization. During his career, he has been recognized as one of 110 advanced certified fundraising executives, one of 94 certified master trainers within AFP, and in 2009, he was named a top 14 most influential fundraisers in the United States by Nonprofit Times. For this presentation, he will focus on the career preparation and advancement. Now for some context. As I thought about this confluence of pandemic and racial equity awakening unearthed by the killing of George Floyd, I thought about career concerns associated with diverse individuals of color, and concerns regarding advancement in the field, as well as, or at the very least, being accepted. I thought about the historical context of not being included, of being pigeonholed, being put at lower level support positions, or even a mismatch for top prospects or any prospects for that matter. And then I wondered about the current focus, if the inclusion that we're focusing on is exaggerated. So what's different? What will stick and not be transient? COVID-19 presenting a new paradigm shift associated with working in the workplace or working remotely. What impact is this going to have in the diverse space, as well as new opportunities? I'm an eternal optimist. We need to focus on opportunities for the future. So with that, I'd like to invite Ruby Love, who's going to focus on career and donor landscape. Ruby. We're not hearing you.
Thank you so much, Ramone.
Thank you.
This is an exceptionally special time for the four of us, as you mentioned.
It is.
And I just want you to all know that what you're about to see is a crew that was formed, as Ramone said, 30 years ago, still hanging strong. And as we share with you today, just remember fundraising was very different back then. We have come a long ways, but we have a long way to go. So what do I think about the here and now in the profession? Well, I think the profession is actually at a deer in the headlights state of being. My career has allowed me to witness and advise in a number of areas within the field of fundraising and philanthropy, from advising families and family foundations to building teams in large institutions and going alone in grassroots organizations to consulting on major investment strategies for endowment. I always carry the race equity mantle, and I do that because of who I am. Yet in nearly every instance, up until only most recently, has there been a serious, what I call serious intentional look at fundraising as a racist, inequitable practice. Institutions are coming out strong with talk and statements about increasing racial equity in the highest ranks, chief development officers, VPs of advancement, philanthropic advisors, grant writers, plan giving officers, wealth advisors, board members, and the like. But the reality is, for years, that diversity, equity, and inclusion has been on the agendas of those positions and the institutions that you're represented in. The numbers are not showing the level of change that constitutes racial equity. So the three of us on this panel have been in the business for over 30 years. That constitutes a generation. Fewer than 10% of all who report they are fundraisers are people of color. And I'm talking about African American, Latino, Asian, Pacific Islanders, and Indigenous. Many development offices have pivoted to respond to the coronavirus needs of their constituents. Many have even ramped up to support Black Lives Matter issues in their organizations and communities. But the big question is, how long will we have that attention? Can the day-to-day programs that that before COVID, that drew all of your 100% attention, sustain in a new development office? Is this the next normal in fundraising that we're experiencing? How much is any given institution or organization going to invest in uncovering the racist policies and practices of fundraising in their midst? How much will associations and fundraising centers of education, like Columbia University, actually concentrate on impact and influence the practices of racism in the sector? As my friend Boulay says, we must embrace the messy and difficult, yet wonderful role that we each play in bending the arc towards justice. It includes wrestling with the fact that our current development model is a form of white moderation designed to help white people feel good about themselves and thus maintain the status quo. It includes a lot of necessary evolution of thinking and practice on our part. So I'm often asked, what's the validity of the pipeline problem, Ruby? People frequently talk about and worry there just aren't enough qualified candidates to meet the expectations of the positions. My answer to that is, there's not a pipeline problem. The problem exists in this tightly held belief that you need to have a certain title, certain pedigree or position or experience to fit and to be valuable to an institution or an organization. The industry has actually taken what I call, and you've seen on TV, the easy button, and defaulted to white women. This seminar does not have time for me to go into this dynamic, but I will say, when I entered the field, it was predominantly white men. Today, it's predominantly white women. You may need a shot of tequila for this next statement. White women have proven to be the greatest benefactors of affirmative action in the civil rights movement to date. Dr. Ramone Segree, your professor, is an anomaly. Alphonce Brown, the upcoming speaker, is an anomaly. Two highly, highly accomplished fundraising professionals, and they're Black men. The exception to the rule in over 30 years of supposed diversity, equity, and inclusion. As my dear friends Mel and Pearl Shaw teach, it actually was not that long ago that Black and brown people were not welcome in many white people's homes. And you know how much our best work often happens in the comfort of a donor's home. It's difficult today for Black and brown voices to be heard in predominantly white organizations. The culture of most organizations does not allow for open conversation about race, power, and privilege. The idea of being qualified for leadership and other jobs in the organization does not include awareness or competency related to race, racism, or connections to or knowledge of communities. Lived experience is seldom on our position descriptions when the search firm markets any position in the fundraising department. So often when you do have Black, brown, and Indigenous employees, they are made to feel like other. Where I see the greatest racial disparity today in our field is employees of color are expected to repeatedly prove their capabilities, while white employees are more likely to be evaluated for their expected potential. So what might we see as changes in the fundraising profession because of a heightened attention to what I call the 400-year-old racism pandemic and the 7-month-old coronavirus pandemic. There's actually a confluence of things happening. There's an amplification of race and disease that now is unprecedented. No longer is it confined to the familiar scenes of disease ravaging Black and brown people in faraway places, for those of you who work on international fundraising, or the raging climate change that has left unchecked, or indigenous peoples, drinking water poisoned and people put in body bags and buried in mass graves, or military armed troops patrolling our streets, and Black and brown bodies murdered in cold blood, and lines of cars waiting for a box or a bag of food. This is here, folks, at home in America, on our campuses, in our gated, tree-lined communities. So it's not just a friction point that we needed for transformational change. It's a multitude of them, and now suddenly they're all present and they're all converging on our world and in our world. So what does that mean for you in your career path? In my estimation, it means if you are not of the people, if you don't have a connection to community, if you don't know how to stand and challenge racial inequality in the processes we use as fundraisers, the messages we convey in media, the contracts we secure, the very missions, the institutions and organizations that you work for, you could easily be positioned as part of the problem. In fact, I'll be so bold to say you are the problem. The table that was once set by white people no longer has its appeal. It has fewer and fewer things on it that don't actually poison the future of the earth. And if you don't believe it, just look at the scramble by Wall Street in corporate America to appease the unrest and put the to appease the unrest and put the plate out there that they hoard and treasure at all cost. And on that plate is money. Money is not the remedy. It is and always will be simply a tool. And our job, your career, your professed skill is that you know how to attract the donor and the volunteer to distribute their money for good. Philanthropy, we all know, is the love of mankind, of humankind. And together the philanthropist and the fundraiser join forces to express that love. White supremacy throughout our world has created such a complexity of institutions and systems. Those institutions and systems we are finding are dehumanizing. White supremacy is dehumanizing. And that is why you hear so many people saying today they feel dehumanized. We're treated less than human. So what does this mean for your career path in fundraising? Here are my 5 takeaways to you. In my estimation, it means you have an enormous opportunity and responsibility to disseminate and educate yourself and others about the inequities you witness and see in fundraising and philanthropy. It means you make sure that Black, brown, and indigenous people are at the tables you participate in when developing your prospect list or deciding who will be the investors of the endowment. It means you stop the public recognition of donors by the level of their donations, where we list the names of the highest contributors first and then move down to the lowest. Stop devaluing every gift. Seriously, do you have major and minor donors? It means you recruit, mentor, sponsor, evaluate, elevate, retain Black and brown people into positions of authority and decision in organizations and institutions. Pressure white people who have hoarded the seats of influence and power to step aside. And finally, act in a way that is welcoming and authentic to Black and brown people in the profession and the sector. Why? Because it's your responsibility. Don't look to the next person. You are it.
I think that I was unmuted, so I was saying that Ruby's presentation was insightful, and please to enter your questions in the Q&A box. And now we will have Issues of Equity by Maria Gitin. Maria?
Thank you, Ramone, for inviting me. And Ruby, thank you for your always spot on, insightful comments, which will even allow me to condense mine more since there are so many points of intersection As mentioned, we've known each other for a long time, but in fact, the four of us have never co-presented before. And I am a more informal person. I want to say that I have not presented on a webinar in this format before, so I'm a little bit nervous, and I hope that you'll all be tolerant of that. So when we are facing these issues, which we are right now, of the pandemic and the, as Dr. Segree has called, the racial awakening, which seems to be coming very late for a lot of people, but better late than never, it can bring up a lot of feelings. And one of the things I've learned over my long life working in racial justice is that it is really helpful to slow down, not to speed up to action, but to actually, right now we are over 100 of us all over the country, on all the coasts and north and south. Breathe into the moment that this is actually a gathering of people who do care. And that means a lot to me. I think it means a lot to all of us that we care. Another way to deal with the kinds of feelings that come up when we have a lot to deal with is to choose the path, the one that's best for you. Just as many people choose their sport, their golf, their tennis. To me, a white person who becomes late in life racially aware, I was lucky early in life to be informed early and often as a teenager. But when you become aware, you just can become overwhelmed. I have a girlfriend who calls me and she's like crying all the time. And I'm saying, this is not helpful, crying all the time. That's not what people of color need from you. So finding your own path, whether that's going to be through teaching, through writing, through, as Ruby mentioned, being part of opening the pipeline to people of color, finding out who is mentoring people and moving barriers out of the way for them, or advocating yourself, having the courage to be the person within your organization who stands up for racial justice, not just for numbers. As Ruby said, we've moved the needle on women numbers to where we're dominating, and that's true also throughout universities and other higher eds, but then not corporate boardrooms. So I don't really have a lot of answers, but I just wanted to raise a couple questions for our consideration and allow time for you all to respond to all of us in the questions, which is also, as Ruby mentioned, who gets to decide who's a donor? Who gets to decide who is a natural born leader? It seems that as long as the people who are seen as leaders look alike, went to the same kind of schools, come from the same socioeconomic background, have the same gender identity, that we're not going to make a lot of progress in diversification and empowerment of the terrific leaders of color who exist in our profession and in our schools. Narrow constituencies lead to blind spots. And this is true with donors also, that we may not consider. I know a gentleman who's one of the largest philanthropists in my county said, at first only other Asian groups asked me until the word got out that I was willing to give to white groups. So if you don't have diversity in your contacts, in your team, in your life, in your profession, you're going to miss out on all kinds of opportunities, including fundraising opportunities. To my mind, when people talk about a good cultural fit, that is just like an automatic barrier to inclusion, because a good cultural fit would not be somebody who grew up in the country, who is more informal, who's older, which would be me. Whereas I might have information that could be incredibly valuable to somebody of a completely different background. So I think we really need to examine that assumption. We also sometimes talk about the importance of shared values, but right now, how can we have shared values when we don't even have the same news media? I imagine on this call that there are people who get their primary news from Black Twitter, from Al Jazeera, the BBC, NPR, maybe even Fox. That's a joke. And we can't just make assumptions about what other people are thinking or why they're acting or asking or submitting the proposals that they are. We really have to listen behind linguistic styles, beyond various characteristics. I know those of you who are international students have this happen all the time, where you can tell somebody's looking at you like, oh, you're Chinese, and they have their Chinese filter on, so they're not seeing you with what you're saying, which is, let's do this, and what a good idea that is. So it really is incumbent on us white people to look at the barriers that we have in our own minds, as well as the ones in our institutions. On that note, it is absolutely essential that white people stop denying the reality of Black people and people of color and Indigenous people. We have been doing this for 400 years, saying, I didn't mean it that way, I'm not a racist, you shouldn't feel that way. Constantly, if I hear anything from my African American friends, it's how white people, colleagues, junior people, supervisors, constantly saying, you shouldn't feel that way. If we are unhappy to be learning that we're part of the problem, we need to work that out within ourselves and within our own groups and not put that on other people. But I will tell you, it is very possible to remove your blinders. I have a lot of confidence in young white people today. I've seen you out in the demonstrations. I've seen you writing papers. I've seen you doing racial study groups. I know people are working on it. Just slow down and take time to resolve things rather than try to make yourself comfortable as quickly as possible. Racism exists, it's a real thing, and we have to invest literally time and money and resources to get rid of it. A question that I throw out for discussion, which I certainly can't answer, is also, how can people who do identify as Black, people of color, effectively challenge European domination of the institutions you work with and still keep your jobs, which I know is important to you, especially now. I'm wondering if those of you who are white feel grateful or anxious that Black leaders are once again asking, demanding really, that we step up. The last time I was aware of this level of call to please do something about racism was when I was a teenager in the civil rights movement. And as Ramone mentioned, I was fortunate to get the call, along with several hundred other white kids, to leave school and go south and work in that movement. But what I learned there is also what you will learn if you decide that you have to take on this work, which is, we didn't go there to teach Black people how to be white or even how to survive within white institutions. We went there to learn from them what their real lived experience was and how we could help them resource the levers of power to change that lived experience, to change that system. And we didn't change it enough. It still needs changing, but the levers for change are still there. The guidebook is there. It's been there for 400 years. Black people have always seen whiteness as a race, and for many, many other people, it's been kind of a shock to realize that people see you as white, just the same as you have always seen other people as people of color. And it can be very uncomfortable if this is new for you. Once again, if this is a new experience, explore it within white racial justice groups and books and podcasts and webinars. There's much work that can be done. but don't put it on people of color to make you feel okay about the bad things that white society has done. We can fix it. We can be part of the solution. And part of the way that we can be part of the solution is to be fearless in looking for the possibility that we are part of the problem, that I'm still part of the problem, no matter how long I've been doing this work. Look for the barriers that are in your institution and be fearless about speaking up and removing them. Take responsibility for them. Don't put racial justice on the shoulders of your brothers and sisters of color. It's our responsibility. And lastly, networking is everything. We all know that. We all know each other because of networking. And people who only hang out with and network with people who went to similar schools, who had the same use of the English language, who like to do the same things, are going to be limiting their opportunity. There is, as Ruby said, there is no shortage of incredibly talented, diverse fundraising professionals, students, faculty, and philanthropists in the pipeline. The problem is we've been clogging up the pipeline without having best practices in racial equity. So one of the most important things we can do is to get out of the way at minimum. And number two, connect with our Black colleagues who are mentoring people and find out how we can be even more helpful in broadening the pipeline. So I want to thank you all again. It's just great to be here with my dear old friends and look forward to your questions in the chat.
Maria, we really thank you. That's so insightful. Maria has mentioned lived experience, and I think you hear that from her. And what you provided us in terms of thoughts regarding racial equity and how we can slow down and learn is a wonderful message. Thank you. Alphonce Brown is now going to speak with us regarding career preparation and advancement. Alphonce.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you, Ramone. If I were asked if I thought COVID-19 were going to provide the watershed moment that would cause nonprofit organizations to recognize a need to embrace diversity, inclusion, and equity, my response would be the smart ones will. Those organizations that understand that diversity, inclusion, and equity work to everyone's benefit. However, even though I'm an optimist, I would venture to say that most of them will not, for the reasons that my friend Ruby Love so well articulated. What that means is that we, people of color, will still have to carry the mantle, will still have to be the catalyst for change, and especially for those work for those organizations that we know that are bringing about those philanthropic benefits to the communities that we serve. A recurring challenge that many minority fundraising professionals endure is how do we plan his or her professional career? For many older senior fundraisers like me and colleagues, we very well may have gotten into the profession by happenstance. And we didn't really plan out what our career might entail or might be. It doesn't mean that we weren't successful at it, because in many regards, as Ruby has pointed out, and as Maria has pointed out, we may have been the only ones in the field that were doing the kinds of things that we needed to do. And we've ended up in a place, at least I can say that I have, where I can look back and be very proud of what we've been able to accomplish, but by no means is that enough. What I will say is that today, there are minorities and people of color, all people of color, that have a different circumstance, especially as it entails the profession as a whole. It's different today. And my point that I want to make is that it's not too early or too late for one to implement career planning. Moreover, we should do this if for no other reason that in the past, our career aspirations have been left to the discretion of the employer. And those are one of the things that I would say that we want to definitely avoid. Just as one would not want to begin a trip not knowing where you're going to start or the departure point or the ultimate destination, I'm suggesting that the successful fundraiser today of color must embark on a path where you're considering what your options are as they lie ahead, and then basically be willing to take advantage of them. Few people enter the workforce thinking that they're going to be at that job for the rest of their lives, much the same way that my parents did. My mom taught school for 34 years. My dad worked 2 jobs for over 45 years. That's not the case when it comes to fundraising professionals, and certainly not the case when it comes to fundraising professionals who are minorities. We want and expect to grow, secure promotions, achieve financial parity as well along the way. And it's important that we understand that the playing field is still as unequal and unlevel as it was many, many years ago. When we started with NSFRE, I would say that the number of minorities in toto existed some 30 years ago with 0.002 or 1%. Today, we have probably closer to 8 or 9% in the whole profession that we count in AFP. So what I'm saying is that it's incumbent upon us as professionals, as people who are wanting to give back. And I do feel that the field of fundraising and philanthropy is one of the most noble professions that there is. We're able to come to the rescue of individuals and people when others cannot. One of the things that I learned from my mentor growing up was that I was my best critic and also my worst one, in part because as someone who was entering the fundraising profession where there were few people that looked like me, I set the standard for what I would do. Very often my goals were far more stringent than any that an employer could place upon me, because it was so important that we do the job even when people might think that we could not. And we persevered. So we still have a lot of that going on, and it might as well be cognizant of it, recognize it, embrace it, and as we get support, as we educate both other individuals of the struggle, and they understand what some of the things are that we face, it emboldens us to make change in a more significant way. I will say that whether you're a newcomer or a senior fundraiser, and if you're a minority, it's an important task for you to assess your skill deficits. It's important for you to know what you don't know and then learn it. And that's especially important for people who are people of color. It's important that you peruse the job postings if you're looking for work, that you know that you're increasing in your skill sets that are required today, which often include being able to communicate very, very well with people, having strong interpersonal skills. You have to be productive in terms of developing relationships. And you have to, in some cases, demonstrate strategic thinking ability, as well as being highly motivated and assertive. Primarily when you're dealing with philanthropy and fundraising, I would say that you really do have to like people. That's one of the prerequisites. Then the challenge comes in matching your temperament with the type of fundraising opportunity that you would wish to secure, and then knowing what your competencies are. Secondly, you need to know what the value is that you bring to an organization. And as you ferret out which ones of these might be more appropriate for you, you might ask yourself the question, would it be better for me to work in a large or small organization, a mid-sized one, that will work toward improving the lives of youth? Or might my talents be better served in an organization that supported the local symphony or orchestra, simply because you like music? Would an entry-level job at a minority or majority higher educational institution provide you with the competencies that you would need to move up the career ladder? Or perhaps would you prefer to work with for an HBCU simply because you know that the need is great and your contribution would have a greater impact? What I'm suggesting is that you analyze what your competencies are, you pair them up with opportunities that definitely do exist out in the workplace, and that you deliberate and see which ones that you might have the greatest interest. Second point is that it's important that you know what the marketplace is. There are indeed differences between the various nonprofit organizations. Arts, there's not one size that fit all. Arts are different than educational institutions. Social and community service organizations are different, perhaps in the approach with health than health organizations. Hospitals, health and hospitals are different than faith-based organizations. One path does not aggregate working for the other, but it's always a good idea to determine if your values and interests are aligned with the organization that you are trying to apply for. You can be employed, gainfully employed, and I would say in today's market, the average stint for a development person is less than 3 years generally. And if I were coming up, and you don't have to come up, you can, it's the days of staying on a job for 8, 10, or in one case, one of my colleagues retired at 28 years are long and gone. We constantly have to be sharpening our toolkits. We constantly have to look at seeing how we assess future opportunities so that it aligns with our professional growth. We have to investigate other opportunities that exist in the sector if and when after 2 years you see that there's little or no opportunities for advancement. I would suggest that you start doing that, in part because sometimes if you are a practitioner, it may take anywhere from 6 months to 24 months for you to find an opportunity. And in this particular environment, it could go either way, because I know that because people are suffering and there's a need to raise money, there are organizations that are looking for development folk. But I also know that there are organizations that are looking for the payroll, and the first thing that might go is the development person. I don't know how you explain that, but that's generally has been the case with a number of organizations. So you have to be very deliberate in terms of how you're looking and how you're planning for the future. And I think that certainly COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter present opportunities that we have to look and research much the same way that we would if we were looking to cultivate and ask a donor for a major gift. I would say that one other thing that's important, when you discover that you are wanting to move up the ladder. And you can do that, particularly when given a window where people are at least open to saying, what are some of the solutions? I don't think that they're easily found. You have to have a commitment on the part of the leadership, whether it's the board and others, to make those kinds of cultural decisions happen within an organization. But what I would say is that it's incumbent upon each of us that are in, and I say us meaning people of color, that we seek to increase our skills, that I'm a proponent of certification. When I came on board, the panelists that are on this webinar today, each of them had their CFRE. There were less than 100 Black folks in SFRE, which changed to AFP. 95% of the African Americans in that group had their CFRE. That's saying a lot, in part because they not only had to be good, but they had to be better. One of the things that I was determined to do was to ensure that as the first African American chair of the board, or second African American chair of the board, that I would get my ACFRE. The first was Charles Stevens, our mentor, and he set the path for all of us that you see today. I would encourage you that as you look at the kinds of things that you need to do, consider getting certification, simply because we know that that will be helpful to you in making sure that you are validated, that you come credentialed, that you've been bona fide, so to speak, and in fact, that positions you, it doesn't say it's arguably an advantage later on, but I would say that it certainly does open the door and differentiates you from other competitors that might be seeking a similar job. So Ramone, those are the kinds of things that I think the dynamics are still positive today. I want to think that they're positive, but they're also difficult. There are challenges that if we're thoughtful, and for those folks that really do want to engage, we can, really make some significant change.
Alphonse, those are really helpful comments. As we've looked at where we've been and some challenges that we now have at this confluence and some racial equity issues, one could say ultimately there is significant responsibility for the individual, as you point out, to be preparing for their career, to be looking at what they need to do to advance the career when they're in. So again, thank you so much for that. We have some questions, and I want to encourage those who haven't submitted questions to please do so. We've got about another 10 minutes in front of us. But I want to read, if I may, this first, which isn't really a question, but it's a statement. And it is, thank you for your message, Ruby. As a white male looking to move into the profession, your words hurt and moved me. Boy, talk about intersection of words, feelings as such. That's pretty demonstrative. But the moved me part is that it's touching this individual at a very personal as well as professional level. Another person says, what are your experiences in identifying, recruiting, and retaining donors who consider themselves social impact investors? Ruby, that's probably one for you. You want to unmute yourself. Ruby, you'll need to unmute, please.
There you go. Sorry. Yeah, so in response to the first statement, that's a natural experience and feeling, and you need to step into it and understand that, when you have the opportunity to do some of the 5 things that I talked about as you move into this profession, do that. The big thing that white men and white women are going to have to learn how to do, it is to stand up against racism. I'm not discouraging you from going into the field, but you need to be able to call it out when you see it and practice seeing it, practice hearing it. In relationship to the second question from Ralph, who, by the way, is a friend of mine on LinkedIn, the whole area of social impact investors, they have essentially set themselves apart from what we would call the philanthropists, and the social impact investor is an investor. They're not a donor, and the reason that we say they're an investor is because they actually have a monetary return that they are expecting for their investment, but they operate in the nonprofit sector. And so what I'm seeing as in terms of how you approach them and how you connect with Black and brown impact investors is essentially the same way you would with any philanthropist. Always remember, a philanthropist and investor is the same person. They have 2 pockets, one on the left and one on the right. Doesn't make any difference. It's still about the money they pull out of those 2 pockets, and what are you going to do with it. In the philanthropic community, we're talking about what are the outcomes that my donation is going to make. On the investment side, the investor wants to know what's the return on my investment. So in other words, what percentage and how quickly am I going to see a return? So I don't really distinguish between the 2. I often talk to those individuals and let them know that I know that they function in both worlds and that I'm able to speak with them fluently in either situation.
Yes, thank you, Ruby. So at my institution, this person indicates, I think recruiting fundraisers from diverse backgrounds is hampered by many things. But one of them is our existing unwelcoming climate and culture. It's a chicken and egg problem. But how do you think that we should start to fix this culture? Anyone?
This is a chronic problem that goes back to some of the points that both Ruby and I made about culture fit. People tend to hire people who seem to fit in with their culture. And if you, depending on where you are at your institution, really doing a racial barrier inventory, look at what might be standing in the way. Is it the fact that everybody is always hired who went to the same school together or the same socioeconomic group? And I'm sorry, the sound, I got a little distracted there from the question. I'm hearing some banging noise from somewhere. That we need to, first of all, as Ruby said, just face the issue exists and bring it up. And you can do an assessment just like you do a feasibility study for a campaign. Go around and develop an assessment based, use one of the, Drucker or one of the other standard assessment tools and develop it. What do you see in our institution? What do you think are the barriers? Is it that you don't know anybody? Is it that the people you don't think are so-called qualified, as we discussed earlier? Maybe you need to remove the requirement that everybody in your department have a master's degree. Some of the best fundraisers I know don't have advanced degrees. I shouldn't say that to a university, but that's just some start points, is to look at what you have and don't have inside, to do an evaluation, and then look how you can remove those barriers instead of just going blindly recruiting on Blackness or Asianness or Chineseness or whatever you're looking for. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you, Maria. We've got a couple questions that have to do with prospect research. Folks see an opportunity to distinguish and improve their methods by identifying prospects that can complement the donor pool. But how can they, through research sources or whatever, educate themselves regarding donor preferences and characteristics, as well as identifying and including persons of color?
Yeah, so I want to talk just a little bit about this because you're going to find that in many situations, Black and brown people are not going to show up in your prospect research pool. We are just, number one, I want everyone to understand that the idea of wealth, and so prospect researchers are actually looking at wealth levels. The idea of wealth within Black and brown communities, and when I'm talking about brown communities as it relates to wealth, it's generally predominantly going back to the Latino community and to many of the South Asian communities. The ability to reach the levels of wealth that pull you into a wealth engine are limited. And so you're going to want to actually look at some of the organizations that we belong to as donors. So, you know, Donors of Color Network, some of the Black and Brown giving circles. Those are the places that you're going to have to go to. And you're going to actually need to work in terms of getting to know community. This is what I'm saying. If you have no relationship in the Black community, in the city or the town that you live in, you're going to have a hard time doing prospect research because we're not going to show up in those databases as you would find white people. And so that's also a great reason to have fundraisers on your teams that actually are representative of those communities, because that's actually who they relate to, who they are. So that's how I would, respond to that. And it's going to be difficult. You don't find us using the technology oftentimes that we have at hand.
And Ramone,
Yes, please.
just to piggyback on that thought, frequently you have people who say, or organizations who say that we can't find minorities to actually fill the positions that we're looking for. I will tell you that I've traveled all over the country as the chair of AFP, and they exist. We exist. One of the AFP affinity chapters in Washington, D.C. met when they launched their first affinity program. There were 80 Black folk that showed up for the African-American one that we would never have found.
Alphonse?
Yes?
Alphonse and team, I wanted to point out that it's 6:59. I really don't like stopping you at midstream, but I think that people do understand where you were going with that. And I want to say to everyone that we are a resource for you. We've been introduced to you. You know how to contact us. I mean, the Q&A, the rest of the questions, et cetera, are really rich. Again, I want to thank the presenters, and I want to thank those of you who attended. I want to thank, again, the Nonprofit Management Program and the staff who enabled this webinar, and I want to call their names: Robin Smith, Megan Candio, Elizabeth Picard, and Angie Ferrer. And I'd ask everyone to follow us on social media for all the events for the upcoming academic year. Thank you to everyone. And by the way, we four, great reunion.
We agree. You can find me on LinkedIn.
Thank you.